We'll get back into Hebrews. I've been using this as the description of the book, but I've kind of decided I need to change that a little bit. Having said that, I think this is where I'm going to leave this description from now on going forward. It's not a letter, it's a homily, a sermon to the Christians of Rome, but not necessarily in Rome. And I'll tell you something else about that later. I didn't know if I'd mentioned this, so I want to be very specific about it. Who are wanting to turn to Judaism. So before I had this saying that who are familiar with Jewish tradition, but what I think is a better, more accurate way to say it is that they are wanting to turn to Judaism. They're not Jews, most likely. They are Gentiles. We've established that before. But very specifically, what's happening here is they want to become Jewish. They want to leave Christianity to go to Judaism, which they may or may not have been a part of before they were Christians. Remember, there were Gentiles who followed the Jewish traditions, who went to the synagogues and that sort of thing because they appreciated the Jewish religion. They could have been before they became Christians, or they could have become Christians straight out of paganism, and now they want to abandon Christianity for Judaism. Keeping Jesus around, but not making Jesus the focus. And there's some reasons for that, and I'll get to that in a second. I don't think I'd explained that properly, and it's really a pretty important concept as to why. Because obviously what the writer of Hebrews is trying to do is get these people to not be Jewish, but to be Christians. And this is why. So the idea is to dissuade them from going back to Judaism or going to Judaism, but to help them cope with the persecution that results from that. If you're a Christian, you get a kind of persecution that you don't get if you're in the Jewish tradition, if you're worshiping in the Jewish tradition. And I'll stick to the written by Apollos because I still think that's a possibility that can be mentioned. So why abandon Christianity for Judaism? So to get this set up completely. During the reign of Julius Caesar, and then again in the reign of Caesar Augustus, the Jews were given specific rights that were basically exemptions from serving the pagan gods. The Jews didn't have to worship in the pagan way. Everyone else did. And if you didn't, you could be persecuted for not worshiping the pagan gods because you might make the pagan gods mad. But Jews, under Julius Caesar, were granted an exemption to that. So you could be Jewish and not worship the pagan gods. And then there were various other things. Caesar Augustus reaffirmed those ideas. And as time went on, there were some situations where, with Caligula, who was between Augustus and Claudius, who did some things that denied these rights that were offensive to the Jews. But by the time we get after him, Claudius restores those rights in Alexandria and other places. But I wanted to mention this, in 49, he actually decrees that all the Jews in Rome have to leave the city of Rome. So he did that because of what is called by Suetonius an instigation of Chrestus. And a lot of scholars think that Chrestus is actually Christ, that the Christians and the Jews in Rome were fighting. And because of that, he made all the Jews leave because he saw it as a Jewish problem. Crestus could have been a real person, not Christ, and he was the source of the instigation, but because the two words are so close together, that's an idea that has developed by some scholars. What that would suggest is that perhaps, and this is definitely not something we can say for sure, but perhaps the persecution that these people are facing was instigated at that time and had continued on thereafter, and that's why he was trying to help them with the persecution. So we don't know that either. But for some reason, these Christians want to be Jews instead to avoid the persecution that comes with Christianity, because you no longer technically qualify for the exemptions that the Jews have. And the way they see it in their brains, they can still reverence Christ, they can still reverence Jesus and be a Jew, because that's basically what was going on in the earliest times anyway. What do you believe about Christ? And when I use that term, I'm talking about you, but I want you to be the people that the author of Hebrews is writing to. You've got to see this from their perspective for the book to make the most sense to you. So what would you believe about Christ in this time if you're in their situation? You could see him as a martyred prophet, but who's risen from the dead. So he would be like the prophets of the Old Testament, but having been killed and has risen from the grave. Or, as I talked about earlier, a special angel, but an angel who has taken on a human form and then been killed and is risen, and then God elevated him to a position. This is right before this in Luke, but in all three of the synoptic gospels, Jesus asks the disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" And they give their response, which is very similar to this. This actually comes a little bit before that in Luke. Now Herod the Tetrarch heard about all that was happening, and he was perplexed, because it was said by some that John had been raised from the dead, by some that Elijah had appeared, and by others that one of the prophets of old had risen. So even in Herod's mind, this is what Herod was hearing about Jesus, that he was John the Baptist raised from the dead, or one of the old prophets raised from the dead. So we know that idea was already out there. So seeing Jesus as a raised prophet isn't a stretch for these people. And then we've already talked about how Paul says in Galatians, "You received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus." So there's that close association already in people's minds. So both of these things would be a possibility. So while it seems very strange for us to take Jesus from the Son of God, God himself, back to one of these lower positions, it wasn't strange to them. It was a natural course for them, because the struggle at this time was to raise him from this, because that's where a lot of people already were. So keep that in mind. That's very important to how this whole book gets put together. So to do some review, angels were seen as spiritual beings and associated with a position above humans, but short of God, and then they were worshipped. Here's the reference in Colossians 2 where Paul warns them not to worship angels, because other people are encouraging them to worship angels. That was part of the process, part of the religion that was going on at the time. So the worship of angels was not an uncommon thing. So worshiping Christ as an angel wouldn't have been an uncommon thing. And they were already worshiping things that were above humans, but not gods. Hercules is an example. Even the Roman emperors were now being declared gods after their death, and being thought of as gods before their death. So this whole idea was out there. And then we have these references already prior to Jesus of angels in various levels of power. Angels grouped in these groups, principalities, powers, and those sorts of things. Romans, Ephesians, and Colossians all talk about these thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities, and these words were being used to classify angels and group them into this hierarchy. So there were angels that were more powerful than other angels. But to remember, Paul warned them against not worshiping angels. So we know that was out there. To demonstrate, we've talked about Philo. Philo, again, was a Jew, a Jewish teacher, a Jewish philosopher, and he and Paul were kind of the two sides of the same coin. Philo was educated, probably even better than Paul, and Philo actually used these same terms for these groups of angels. Philo has powers, rulers, authorities, thrones, lords, dominions. So he uses these same terms. So we know this is what was in people's heads. And then to push this thing to a little further about how people thought about angels at the time. Remember in the days of old, consider the years many generations, ask your father, and he will show you your elders, and they will tell you when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage. And remember when they did the Septuagint, then they translated the Hebrew into the Greek, they translated this according to the number of the angels of God. So that's what was in their head. That the angels, each angel had a nation that it was responsible for. And the following of that, what that tells us is that the gods of these countries were seen from the perspective of the translators of the Septuagint as angels. That these nations were actually worshiping as God, these angels. Deuteronomy 33 talks about how the law was delivered and how God brought 10,000 of his holy ones with flaming fire at his right hand. When that was translated into the Septuagint, it was called angels. So angels were seen as the ones who actually delivered the law. It was God's law, but the angels were the mediators. They actually delivered the messages. And we have that reiterated in the New Testament. Stephen says, you who receive the law as delivered by angels. And Galatians, the law was added because of transgressions until the offspring should come to the promise that had been made, and it was put in place through angels by an intermediary. So the people of the time understood that angels were responsible for delivering the law. And if they saw Jesus as a deliverer of the law, it's just that much closer to why they would understand him as an angel. So you got all this soup. You got all of this to keep in mind that these people were thinking. One more thing here. He is the radiance of the glory of God, the exact imprint of his nature. He upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purifications for sin, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, having become much superior to angels, as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Here's the setup for what he's about to begin talking about, because these people obviously don't feel like they have to see Jesus as anything more than the level of an angel. So he's going to prove to them that Jesus is superior to angels and that the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. And then I need to point this out, and you'll see why in just a little, but Jesus did this after making purification for sins. This was what Jesus did when he died and was resurrected. He made purification for sins. That's what he accomplished. So we talked about who's better in this hierarchy. We've set up God, then angels, then mankind. So the question that remains then Where does Jesus belong in this? That's the whole argument for the beginning, the first several chapters of Hebrews. Is Jesus between man and mankind? Is he at the same level as an angel? So just about everybody's going to at least put him there, but generally even higher than that. So then the question is, between God and the angels is Jesus? And that's generally the way we think about it from a subordinationist perspective, is that Jesus would go between God and the angels, but he's not quite at the same level as God the Father. That's how they're thinking. So then the question becomes, if Jesus is between God and the angels, how come he's there, and what does that mean? So here's what he's trying to get through in this first couple of chapters. So since we're studying Hebrews, we obviously need to look at Colossians. I want you to see this because this section of Colossians is another one of those creeds that we've talked about. One of those early creeds where this is, even though it's in Colossians, the language here is different. It's actually basically poetic. So that's why it seems to be like what we would technically call a hymn from our perspective, but it's something people memorized and then said out loud back to one another. So this is what that says. Speaking of Jesus, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. All things having been created through him and for him, specifically thrones, dominions, rulers, and authorities, what does that mean? Angels. Jesus created the angels. There's a marker right there that he's above the angels because he created them. And if he created the angels, he couldn't create himself. So he's firstborn of all creation. That's how they get to that. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God is pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile himself to all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Why am I showing you this? Well, because we've seen the same thing in Hebrews. We have exactly this same statement in Hebrews, but it has been taken and, in essence, rewritten into a much more deliberate and very accurate, I guess is the best way to put it, rendering of all these same ideas to set up the entire book. For example, he is the image of the invisible God. So this word image in Colossians is the word icon. It's the word we get icon from. And so it is an image which we would think of more or less as a statue, a bust, that kind of thing. It's got a dimension to it. Hebrews changes it just a little bit and says that he's the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. So if you remember me talking about that word imprint is engraving. So while the icon is one form, this engraving actually cuts into whatever it is. It's the same idea, but a slightly different idea, and a little more powerful, and definitely more poetic. He's the firstborn of all creation. All things were created for him, and for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. All of these things, and particularly the first part, implies some subordinationism. He's not quite the same level as God the Father. He's the firstborn of creation, but that also implies that he was created. Then things were created for him, and in him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Hebrews 1, it says he was appointed the heir of all things. In Colossians, for by him were all things created in heaven and on earth, visible, invisible, all the various things. Same thing here, through whom also he created the world. So God created everything through Christ. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He upholds the universe by the word of his power. He carries the whole world. The whole universe is held together by Christ. And he is the head of the body, that in everything he might be preeminent. He sat down on the right hand of the majesty on high, and having become much superior to angels, and as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. He's preeminent, he's above angels, he's sitting on the right hand. So you see, all these things are included here. There's one more piece of this. Through him, to reconcile himself, God reconciles himself to all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. So here's what Jesus did. Jesus made peace through his blood on the cross. It's put this way, as I showed you a minute ago, after making purification for sins. So we have again the same idea that Christ's blood did something for us. The writer of the book of Hebrews was using the thing that people already had, this creed, and writing it to them to set up all the stuff he's going to say. So that gets us back to this point. So now we can probably start verse 5. For to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son, today have I begotten you? So we're going to Psalm 2. That's where that comes from. And a lot of what he says in these verses comes from Psalms. And he uses what's in Psalms to demonstrate the relationship between Christ, the Messiah, and God. Because God is calling Jesus the Messiah, or maybe to put that a better way, these people were still willing to see Jesus as the Messiah. And if they saw Jesus as the Messiah, they had to understand what God had said about the Messiah and how that changes the way they need to look at him. That's how he's going to prove that Jesus is better than the angels. He's better than what they're trying to make Jesus. That's where we will be going for the rest of this chapter and the next couple chapters after that. So I think I can start verse 5 now. All right. No promises, because I don't know what I'll stumble on when I might get into this. So we'll pick it up there next week.